off
How
to
have you
the
been?
races. It is good. It is good. I've been just running around just a little too much, and I think we're in a similar age where I can see why people, as they get older, they want to have less stuff, and they want to simplify their lives and lose some of the baggage and the garbage, right? Both stuff and people, right? Because you get to this point where you realize, hey man, I got all this stuff, and every person and every piece of stuff I own requires maintenance, and it either requires money to maintain it or time to maintain it, and the worst kinds of things require both time and money, right? And then the absolute worst of this are the things that require time and money and suck your energy.
See, this is what happens in decline, you end up conserving what you've got, whereas on the way up, you feel like you're a ball of extra energy and you've always got enough. It's exactly what happens to systems and empires, same process. Except for they don't divest fast enough to compensate.
Yeah, and I think, and this is why I've been wanting to talk to you for ages, and I think that the macroeconomic environment, or let's call it, I have a new word for it called geo-macro, right, is so threatening and so, in some cases, so depressing, where in life and in business we run these short-term, can I call them micro skirmishes, right? And I can run those all day long, and I can pick up the ball and run with those, but when you're running those into this headwind of this big, nasty geopolitical mess, you almost, and society seems to be failing at the same time, you almost think, what the fuck am I doing this for? I want to check out and go find a little cabin and go ice fishing. I mean,
well, you've got two options, right? Option is you think you can run for it and you can hide. But as I will explain, that isn't an option because it goes everywhere. And so, back in 19, when I promised, I started managing money in about 13 because I knew they were going to print so much money. There was no alpha generation. There was just a beta trend, which didn't really suit me or the idea. And I'd created this understanding of what money printing represented, which is the end of productivity and creativity in America and the Western system. And you basically print money to compensate for loss of creativity and productivity. And under that illusion, it carries on with momentum until it hits a brick wall. And then in 19 and a half, I kind of went, oh shit, this is like, we're really close now. So I thought, well, I'll just go and raise some more money and I'll go and do it, and I'll make a lot of money like I've always done in every big decline, like it'll be a landslide. And then I had this moment, and the moment was I created a book as a dyslexic because I had children and I had worked out what was going to happen to us and I wanted to share it. And that book took a long time to write, but its construct was 2002 and 7 years to get out there. And I felt like I had to do it because I had children, and their mess therein is our responsibility. And then I came to this conclusion in 19, it didn't matter how much money I made, it was irrelevant, because the question is, will our society actually manage to get through the next decade? This period of decline of America, the rise of China, this great hegemonic clash, all the things that we're seeing around us fit into this. And it is literally a battle between democracy and autocracy. And the tools that the CCP have created to control their own population and the Uyghurs and the people in Hong Kong mean that in democracy, we will be subjugated, and you and I as individuals and our genes will be exercised. You're looking at the bleakest history possible if we lose this. And so I set up Global Forecaster because if you manage money, your investors say, no, you can't talk to the public. You've got to manage money. And then they take it away from you, and the whole thought goes on. So I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to start.
They're in conflict. They're actually in conflict with each other.
Although I don't think they are at our age, but they happen to be in the eyes of your clients. So I created Global Forecaster, where its main mission was to transmit information to educate, whether it's the general public in one section, let hedge fund managers access the hedge fund model so they could see, well, if this works, what else is right? And then also access politicians and the military, which is exactly what I've done at the highest levels, to try and push them off the pedestal of this linearized, conservative, disastrous route they're on. And over 3.5 years, it's done all of that. I haven't made a difference. Well, maybe I have. There are some things that I can and can't talk about, where I think that it's no longer about did David make a difference, because we make a difference subtly by our existence and changing minds subtly that people won't necessarily attribute back to you. And in that regard, I sense there has been, but has it been enough to defer the brick wall we're aiming for? No. And just as Churchill couldn't stop the rise of Nazi Germany with the appeasement modes of Chamberlain and co., he was handed the poison chalice when the shit hit the fan and everything was burning, and he had just about the wherewithal to hold it together and bring us out. The trouble is, I think the problem we're in is I'm not sure that by the time that happens and our present leaders have grasped hold of the power into destruction, we are going to be able to get out of what happens, as we'll talk about. So it's really about the survival of democracy in our societies. And you can go fishing in Alaska, but one day mainland America will fall to the Chinese, and the fuckers, pardon my language, will come and find you fishing. They'll get you everywhere. There's nowhere to hide. And if you've got children,
on this happy note, before we get really into this, and I feel like somehow I should be having like cocktails, drinks, or something for this meeting. I thought I should tell you a little bit about David Murrin and who he is, because this is a real challenge. The man's bio is like as long as my arm and my sense of humor. And we met, God, what is it, 20 years ago, something like that?
Yeah, well, it was well over 20 years, Anric.
Oh, easy, yeah. I was running I just started a business called Infinity Capital, and I invited David out to come and speak to my executive team out on Lago di Orta, where I just built a house. And somehow we've always been in touch. But the one thing where our paths cross is, I think you started your career in the jungles of Papua New Guinea. The one place I have sworn I will never, ever go back to again. You know what I mean? Even though the diving is absolutely beautiful. And the
diving is where did you dive, Anric? The diving's phenomenal. Did you go to Madang?
Yeah, I mean, it is magnificently beautiful, but I was there on business the first time, in a suit, running around, trying to give financial advisors backup who were servicing the oil industry executives in the place. And I was kind of their monkey for hire, and I would come in and teach people, big macro moves and how futures worked and managed futures and how shorting worked and all that kind of stuff. And I remember running around Port Moresby in a suit going, I will never do this again. No,
Port Moresby was the best bit. It was civilized, right? I mean, I remember in Madang, the best dives I've ever done. And one of them was a B-24 on its side in 70 foot of water with a fan coral on the wing. And basically you could see the flask of the pilot. And sadly, these guys were taken to the island and beheaded just near their plane, which always was very poignant. I was attacked by a sea snake when I was on that one. I remember that because really horrible little creatures. And then there was a place called Magic Mountain where you went off the coast and there was a seamount that came right up to within 30 feet. And they told you, go down the anchor chain and don't go very far. You get down to the bottom and there were thousands of hammerheads doing the sort of the cowboys and Indians thing. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely spectacular. And, I find most people's bios are actually really boring because they're created in this very chronological way, and you're not like that at all. So yeah, I could go via the whole JP Morgan, London, FX trading, all that kind of stuff. But you know what? Like, nobody really cares about it. They really don't. Yeah.
I'll tell you what they might be interested in, because someone asked a very pertinent question. Why did you come up with your theories, David? And I thought that's a really good question. So what are components in my life came together as threads into this rope and construct? So the first one was, much to the chagrin of my mother, very early on, I was fascinated by military history, like almost pathologically intrigued. Now, that half of the family were all in the army in various, it was almost genetic, but I was so intrigued. And somewhere I'd worked out that in war, you saw the best and worst of human nature, and wars decided history. I mean, I must have been sort of very young when I sort of comprehended that. So that was one kind of thrust. The next one was, unlike many English people in the 70s, our family traveled a lot and a lot to the States. So I saw the world as an interconnected place, as we do as modern people. But back then it was quite rare in the post-war period when everyone in Britain and Europe had slumped. So I saw a large world that was at my fingertips rather than stuff that happened somewhere else. And then I specialized in physics and geophysics, but physics because physics taught me how to think. And it taught this idea that small equations could explain very large paradigms. And it developed the left side of my brain to be really logical. And later on, as a lateral person, that's an important balance because you need both systems to work. You need your search system as a right-brained person to put pieces together, but you then need to have the logic to then actually synthesize it in a way that's articulate, that filters out a crazy idea. And Boris Johnson, for example, was highly lateral, but no linear capability. So then he relied on linear people that undermined him, and the net effect was a disaster. So that kind of part was really interesting for me. And then obviously I went to Papua New Guinea, as we joked, but it was that first day at work when I saw a labor riot where one person, Augustus, wouldn't work in the rain. And I decided to give him a motivational speech, which wasn't really clever in retrospect. But I used the immortal words, "In my country, women and babies work in the rain." And I remember there was this terrible silence. And then an apoplectic man called Augustus, the son of the chief, was branding his machete. And I was 100 miles from help in this sort of clearing thinking, oh, that's really unpleasant. And then all of that anger spread like the ripples in a pond. And now 60 people who, by the way, were cannibals, had eaten flesh within the past couple of years, wanted to kill me. And I remember thinking, that's really great. First day at work. And all I could see was this pebble in a pond and these emotions spread. Anyway, I decided to front it out. I jumped into the middle of them and I walked through them and I walked to my tent and they all gathered round saying, well, that didn't work because normally you're meant to run at that stage and then they chase you and chop you up. But I didn't run, I went towards them and it confused their social construct. So I found myself writing a letter, "Dear Mum, surrounded by cannibals. Don't think I'm going to get through the first day at work, but you were wonderful." and I got through that phase. And what I was presented with was all these children as if they'd been on a naughty step and their emotion had just eviscerated and time decayed. And they were back to work in 4 hours and there wasn't a jot of hatred. Now, compared to our culture, if we're that angry, we'll hate generationally. But they didn't. Anger flowed through them. They shared it. It dissipated. So there I was in my elitist Western phase thinking I must be looking back in history. We were like that one day. And then by hook or by crook, I ended up at JP Morgan. And I never really initially understood how lucky I was to go to such a great house. And standing on the trading floor, I remember thinking, I know nothing. I'm a scientist. Let's look at the economists. How good are they? They've quickly, it was apparent they didn't have a clue what was going to happen tomorrow, despite the gobbledygook they speak. And the guys in the foreign exchange desk actually were really prescient, some of them. And then it occurred to me, we're just like Papua New Guineans. We share our emotions. And that was when the study of
David, is that where you started threading those behavioral investment techniques into your investment philosophy even then?
That was exactly at that moment. Within 3 weeks, I wanted to quantify price because I realized price was a determinant of collective behavior. And I used those techniques basically in all our hedge fund management tools. They were especially good at picking peaks. So every great peak for 20 years, I've never missed one from top to bottom. So they were good at extremes. I had to develop tools much later and to be a more sort of beta person in the calmer periods. That was a bit that I had to work on as an investing style. But what then really happened next was 9/11. And I remember seeing 9/11 happen. And my father was very involved in aviation. I was brought up with the great test pilots in the world and, you know, that top end of aviation. So I knew instantly it wasn't, you know, an accident as they claimed. But most importantly, I found myself in the bath thinking, oh my goodness, what if this end of history story isn't true? What if this is not an accident? It's a significant moment caused by two parts of intelligence agencies not sharing, which is a hallmark of lack of coherence, which is the first sign of decline, internal competition. So I thought, well, what price information is there to suggest decline might be afoot? And of course, with 150 years of any price data, when you compare it to Western civilization that's say 500 years old, maybe the Portuguese 600, there's not enough information. So I found myself thinking, what do I do? So I decided to revert. I built a price model for a system to rise and fall. And then I engineered the psychology of that price model, and I created the 5 stages of empire model. which was very succinct in terms of driven by demographics, regionalization, civil war to lateralize, expansion exponentially, maturity where the lateral people start to be pushed out by the linear thinking people that build large institutions, overextension, and then decline where the whole lot collapses. And very detailed relationships between battles, which are the clocks of empires. And I looked at every empire I could find and I was horrified because we kept doing the same thing. We started to develop things like super empires that, for example, why the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, then the British, Germans tried twice, then America, are actually shortened durations. And I concluded it's because it's a Christian system, which then has the same duration as the old systems like Rome, for example. And it became, I did it not from an intellectually sort of curious perspective, but I wanted to find tools to predict things that we couldn't do. And I'm trying...
All right, I'll let you finish, but I have like 300 questions for you. And so, I know David Murrin, once he gets going, like you can't stop him.
You're allowed to put your foot in my mouth to stop me, don't worry. Right? So and from that, I was shocked. I published Breaking the Code of History in 2009, but it was really written in 2002. Just took ages to kind of put it together. And it had a number of really profound angles. The first one was the warning that the rise of China and the decline of America would lead to a confluence of events at the peak of the next commodity cycle. From 22 onwards, we would enter World War III. And one of my main missions was to explain to people that the hubristic way we were living would end in a conflict that could annihilate us. And therefore, that constant vigilance and understanding of the Chinese agenda was something that, well, you couldn't talk to people about it in 2000 to 2010.
Can you say that again? I missed that. The audio just cut out for me there. Just say that again and slowly, because my brain does not process as fast.
So it was the main construct that in the decline of America as the world's hegemon and the last of the Western Christian empires, and the rise of China as the second of the super empire of Asia following Japan, their rise started in the Boxer Revolution. That confluence was taking place over the next big Kondratiev peak of 2025. And that peak has always brought world wars or significant wars. So I could see the timing of this transference of hegemonic power and this military challenge coinciding with World War III. And the prediction was it would engage from 22 onwards, and we started it with Russia, which we'll come on to. We're in it, completely asleep. We're in it.
We're in it. I totally agree with you. But before we go there, David, let's just connect some of the dots quickly, because I became aware of you when you were the CIO of Emergent Asset Management, late 90s, I would say 99, 98, somewhere around there, right? So after JP Morgan, you did Apollo Asset Management, from what I recall.
Yeah, I did that. It was Apollo Analysis was a macro fund, and also we sold our stuff to all the other people as well. And then the next thing that it rolled into was Emergent Asset Management with my partner, and we were one of the first emerging market macro funds, and we were immensely successful.
Yeah.
So I remember refusing money from Soros, and he said, "But no one's ever refused money." I said, "I'm sorry, but I am, because you're not paying enough, and you'll just copy what we do." It was probably a mistake when I look back at it, but it was a fun moment.
So at that point, people started describing you as a polymath. Can you explain to me what that actually is?
Yeah, well, I had to look it up in a diary, actually, in a dictionary, because it's sort of, poly means many. Yeah. So really, the best way to see it is kind of many-faceted, many expert systems in one that are all cross-correlated. That's the best way to look at it. And there are many aspects to my interests, which many global forecaster actually brings together a large number of them.
Yeah.
What it means is it's really a holistic, lateral way of perceiving the world, and also taking the specialities within that perception to as far as you can, and then understanding it as a holistically interconnected model. It's the best way I describe
it. The conflict I normally have, having run money for 30 years, I find that when you buy macro advice, it's given by people who don't manage money. And they stay in their box, and they tend to be very linear, and they try to prove their points, right? And then I find that the people that are really, really good at managing money, they don't want to share. And they don't want to play nice with others, right? And this is where I find you so unique. I mean, alone, like one of the posts that you once put out a while ago about your dyslexia, and it still reverberates in our house because we talk about this, about the divergent all the time. And that was the trigger event, because Laura Louise and I, we think we are divergents. You know what I mean? And you know, I find this so fascinating how you've taken all these threads and brought them all into this global forecaster model. And I just totally love it. And I think we need like an 8-hour podcast just to get through your background, because it's so fascinating and interesting of how you've taken all of these things. So talk me through the first book. I mean, the first real book was Unlocking the Code of History that I read, or Breaking the Code of History that I read, and it changed my life.
Well, I'm glad it. Thank you. Going back, that's the other bit I missed. The key thread that tied the knot is I am dyslexic. So that means, and I've come to believe that, and it's worth just covering this before we go on to the book, because you've touched on something that's very sensitive. So basically, dyslexia is a lateral right-brained function. So left master-eyed, left-handed, right-brained, and that functionality is by definition lateral. It's, you know, you can see patterns with it that other people can't. You may not be able to spell, you know, you may not be able to do certain detailed actions, but the big picture and how it coordinates, it is the area of dyslexia that makes it. There are more dyslexics at GCHQ and code-breaking organizations than anywhere else you'll find. Like 25% of GCHQ are now dyslexic. For a reason. They see patterns, and I have always seen those patterns. I had to learn to be disciplined in my physics construct to actually then justify how each element of those patterns worked. But I've combined both ways of thinking. And so breaking the code of history was a huge challenge. I mean, when people said I used to speak and write a book, I am dyslexic. Like I could destroy a spell checker's self-confidence in no time. So the idea that basically I could actually go and read what I read the next day was, and spell checkers weren't strong enough to survive me in 2004 and 5. They got better. And I think the greatest thing that I have learned is how to write over the period of this work in trying to communicate. It was a huge barrier. And so breaking the code of history tried to explain, and I set it up with this warning content about China, and also as a self-help book, because I realized that I believe human beings are trapped in an unconscious behavioral loop. And more recently, so I've got a series of theories that describe who we are. And I added 2 theories that actually go in front of the theories in Breaking the Code of History, because Breaking the Code of History explained what we do, but not why we do it. And I have this theory of human anti-entropy. And for those people that are risk takers listening to me, they think this is really esoteric, what's its use? And my answer to that is, if you don't have multiple layers of understanding, you will sit there and take risk and be surprised by something you never even understood. And you'll lose more money than ever because you're narrow focused on something you think is guaranteed, and there's a bigger wave coming over the top of you. So my vision was never to be surprised by having such a large perspective that could telescope down to fine detail and see the big picture. And the big picture, which is a bit of a shock, is the world is entropic. That means the world goes from order to disorder. If your matchboxes fall on the floor and the matches get into the matchbox, someone's replaying life. But they spill everywhere in a form of disorder. And we all know when time goes forwards and backwards. And I have a
great example of that, David, in the Tupperware drawer. Have you ever noticed that? You can arrange that on Monday, put it all perfect, optimal size. By Tuesday, all bets are off.
I've got more tops and not bottoms and bottoms and not. It's just a nightmare session. Or socks are another example. Trying to keep a pair of socks together is a nightmare. But and we're in frivolous, but they're very serious issues. The universe we live in is disordered. And for humanity and living creatures to basically survive it, they have to get control of their environment or master it sufficiently to get through the entropic experience. And the human survival method is to do it through social constructs. More of us together makes it stronger. And so we build social ordered systems, which started with tribes and built with empires, because they build more coherence and what I call anti-entropy. And most human beings are naturally anti-entropic. If you think about your grandmother on the porch, she is losing energy. She's becoming weak, but she keeps her house really tidy. That's an anti-entropic, order out of disorder. And social systems rise and fall as empires. And at the peak of that cycle, that human culture has the most control over its environment and therefore the greatest potential longevity for its offspring. And that's our survival method. Now, there's a couple of fascinating things about this. And that is, we use war to make leaps. And war is the domain of entropy. And the mastery of entropy is a lateral thought process. So dyslexics are adaptable, and they're the adaptable gene in humanity. They're the warrior gene, because in war, right now in Ukraine, you won't find many linear leaders at the top. They're all lateral thinkers that are outthinking the Russians, because the linear ones have lost all their soldiers or sailors or whatever activity because they became predictable. So hunter-gatherers and warriors and war go together, and when a system becomes old, a new one rises to knock it off its perch. And we have been using war to invigorate our societies to be more creative in overcoming and surviving. And war is intrinsically linked with our development. Now, that's so counter-popular to the liberal view that actually we like peace. It isn't. War is, and we've now developed war-fighting capabilities that endanger us. So the thing that moves us higher up the curve of anti-entropy is about to go and eradicate us. So this is the great war ahead of us, where we face do it differently or not survive as well. And that's why deterrence is so important.
So do you think that the book, I mean, this is a straight question. I know you're always a straight shooter. Do you think that Breaking the Code of History is still a relevant book for people to buy and read today?
This is the funniest thing. It's more relevant than ever, because you can read the book and it told you what has happened. Yeah. Yeah. So for someone that wants to say, does your theory work? The truth is in the pudding. I mean, there are little things, for example, the December prior to the arrival of the pandemic, I had, have we lost you? Yeah.
No, I'm just showing you what you're talking about.
Basically, in the book, one of my predictions is the next great pandemic would come from China, and it would come from a PLAN weapons laboratory seeking asymmetric advantage over the West. And so when I saw what happened in Wuhan in December, I knew exactly what it was. Its transmissibility was not normal, and we were facing some kind of outbreak. And I knew quickly, all my clients knew a pandemic was coming on the 1st of January. That's 3 months before most people in the West even cottoned onto it. So there are plenty of things in that book that have talked about how China would, not just that America would decline, but the stages of decline, the lack of social coherence, the fragmentation, the shift towards linearity, and the shift towards uber creativity. And you see that in patent numbers in compared to China versus America. There's twice as many patents coming out of China as there are America. They're out creating because systems do like in that stage.
Because the reason why I ask is that at the moment we're busy packing up this house in Florida that we've just sold.
You need to keep it. You can't throw it away.
No. And it was interesting. And there is something, I don't know whether you wrote this book on like tablets of Moses's tablets or something, but the weight of this book, I mean, literally, if you drop it, it'll break your foot, right? So I'm like getting all these great books, and we've moved a lot in the last few years. So I've had a chance to really cull my library. And I've got this book, which I know is going to make any, regular moving box is going to threaten the integrity of a moving box. And so I'm feeling this book and I'm like, okay, let's see. So I'm like paging through it. I'm like, holy shit, he was right. Holy shit. And it literally, it's all going ching, because suddenly I've got these big picture theories that I've been running in the back, and I didn't realize where they came from. They actually came from me reading that book 10 years ago. And I thought, wow, if he launched this book today, it would probably sell 1,000 times better, because people are suddenly realizing that, wow, this is actually what's happening, right? And that kind of pulls me into the next of the 500 questions I have for you, because if you see yourself as this little spectator in the world, right? And I call this the sugar ant syndrome. I have those tiny little sugar ants that crawl across your counter. I mean, you can basically smudge them out and they're gone. There is no sign of their existence. And that is, I think, what we as humans are like, because if you look at big picture history and you look at the long-term cycles, what we matter and the little ripples that we do, we're basically irrelevant, right? And you look at the world at large at the moment, And it is a very, very frightening place. But if you knew in advance, if the people, let's just pick at the last 5 major declines of empires, or, fall of empires, fall of civilizations, world wars, if you knew this in advance and you could arrange your chess pieces accordingly, and you got it halfway right half of the time, you would still be a billionaire and make so much money with which you can actually do something important with.
Yeah.
Because money does.
It does bring change, used well.
Yes, it does. It does. It does.
So I think what you pointed. So if I go back to, I hoped that by transmitting this information, and people like F.W. Clerk read it and were really enthused by it. Yeah. All sorts of people have said what you said, which is lovely. It changed the way you thought. And I designed the book so that there were pictures and words. The pictures were for the right brain and the words were for the left brain, and they were on the same page. And I wanted it to reprogram the reader, because then they could become more effective in the way they thought about the world, and predictive, and demand more of our leadership. Now, it has happened amongst people who are generically lateral. I will lay a bet that there are almost no linear people who've absorbed the information. Yeah. And one of the things that happens within society is a cascade of change. Lateral people or an individual sees a different angle, then there's a fraternity around them and say, yeah, we agree. It cascades and dripples down to more lateral people. And then there's a big moment somewhere around 8% where suddenly all the linear people go, oh yeah, that's obvious. And I hoped I'd get to that stage. But what has worked against that is essentially the money printing process has been more effective in America than probably any other previous empire, because of the sophistication of the Fed's manipulation. And what money printing does is it compensates for lack of creativity and allows the linear thought process to go into an uber mode. And that allows enough time for those linear people to rise up through financial institutions and political institutions. And right now, 20 years later, we have a Western world dominated with linear thought that works along predictable parameters. And they're all busy going, is this going to work? Like the blip in inflation. It's not a blip. It's going to only peak in 2025. It's the beginning of a correction, because we already should be higher. It was suppressed for 20 years in that contractive cycle because of the manipulation by the Federal Reserve and various other places. So what I'm trying to say is I underestimated how linear our world would come, and therefore how unfertile it was to receive this information. And the problem with lateral people, we're all very individualistic, and we all tend to sort of look at each other with circumspect, but we don't come together and say, as lateral people, shit, like if we don't pull together, forget our interests, we're not going to be here. We're now going to do what we haven't done before, which is, Anric, you and I are going to go and get 10 other people. We're going to create an inner cabal. We're going to talk about what we're going to do. We're going to spread the word because we're too individualistic, and that works against us. And something else has happened to lateral people, which I call the exile of the laterals, which is, in effect, society's linearization has meant that maverick lateral thinking, which is the heart of creativity, has been pushed so far out of the system that half of them are going crazy and mad, disappearing down rabbit holes because they've become paranoid, and they further almost devalue the construct of lateralization, because you look at them and go, well, you're a bit kooky. And what you really need to do is be very centered as a lateral person and not be displaced into that space, because you've got to be a credible alternative to this rational linear thinking with a 3-degree horizon versus the 360-degree horizon we need to have at a time like this.
So do you think you could have more of an impact if you actually managed money and did this for people so that they could jump on board and benefit from your experience? Or do you think you can have a greater impact by actually teaching people how to fish?
Well,
so that they can do it themselves?
The way I've built Global Forecaster is actually a lovely duality, because I've founded on the fact it communicates information openly. And that information, when people pay or hedge funds or CEOs come to me, basically is available to them. All of them are only lateral. The linear ones, busy doing their sort of other stuff. And so they get to see how it works. And there's only a limited people that will actually receive that, because I have a limit on it. If we managed money, it would be exactly the same way as people buying the same place. I wouldn't do it any differently. In fact, for fun, I did this long short alpha product, and literally it's blown the lights out over everyone else for 3 years. And I'm a macro trader, but I've got to say long short trading is much simpler. If you just find the right pairs, find an idea, find the weakest and longest, it's like, it doesn't require the discipline of entry points, all sorts of things. So we have some examples like that on exterior platforms that show just how good it is in its just teeny application. But what is really interesting is most people will invest in you and they're not even bothered to find out why you do it. They'll just hold you as heroic until you stop doing it, and then they'll go, oh, well, that didn't work. So that's not where education is for the general investor. But disseminating information to the thoughtful lateral person is one of the key goals in the cascade. And somewhere soon, as it becomes more and more critical, I can see this. Every time we take a lurch, more people come and ask questions and join the site. But they don't do it in the calm patches. They do it when things become unknown and scary. And for example, I was able to predict Putin's invasion 6 months beforehand with absolute certainty. There was no doubt he was moving that way. The fact that we didn't see what was happening generically shows you just how ill-equipped the world and its leaders are to interpret events in front of it and how that operates.
It baffles me. I mean, like you think of the West, right? And obviously a lot of Americans are so proud of being American that they can't see its own faults and they can't see its own culpability in the whole thing. And obviously, you know, for you and I, having grown up in these, you know, in the world's playground, right? You tend to have a bit more of a perspective when you look at these things. And I cannot understand why the West is not getting out of its own way and even adapting to what is happening right now.
Okay, so let's look at some parallels. And first of all, you know, I spent a lot of time in America, in California when I was young, and I absolutely adore the country. Have lots of friends over there, and so I am a very pro-American Englishman. America is a big landmass that emulated Britain as a maritime power. It's just a bigger version. In Britain, we were small demographics, highly sensitive and super sensitive to other cultures because we could never, ever put more men on the ground than the people we occupied. So we learned to manipulate them, and to do that, you have to understand them. And so it suffused our culture as a maritime power. You were slightly different. Compared to Asia, you were in the same boat, far more populous in Asia and small. But relatively speaking, your continental construct means people can be in the middle and nothing else exists. But the hubris that you're talking about existed in the British Empire. We couldn't see our own decline. We couldn't see that as Germany rose, if we weren't going to fight Germany, we'd fight America, one or the other. America was preparing to fight Britain before Germany. We had two challengers coming right up alongside us, and we were slow to adjust in so many ways. Yes, we built a grand fleet to push back the German fleet, but we thought that our little army would swing the balance. And it was a great little army, but 150,000 men in 3 divisions in the BEF in 1914 was nothing compared to 6 million Germans on the other side, or 5 Frenchmen next year. Although, funnily enough, it was the intervention of the BF that slowed the advance and prevented them taking Paris. So even then we made a difference. But there was a sense of hubris about, who Germans were, the fact they went to sea. And right now, and I've been warning against the rise of the Chinese Navy, because we have built them the biggest industrial base in the world. And if you were a German fighting America, you were like horrified at how many Liberty ships turned up, how many carriers turned up in the Pacific, how many tanks turned up because the industrial base of America. That's now China. China can build 100 major warships a year in a wartime situation. America can build 20. By the time you lose South Korea, and you lose the whole Asian basin, because that's part of the agenda we'll talk about, the shipbuilding capability of the Chinese strips the world. So a war of attrition, it's in as long as they get their resources from the Russians, they're good to go.
Yeah, and they just did that. They just signed those deals, and they've been, we pushed them into that. We literally pushed them into that.
We now, I think, and the 4th book I wrote was Red Lightning. It's how it was written about 2 years ago, How We Lose World War III. And in it, although I thought it was too late, I tried to depict a story where we turned Russia away from China to surround it, in the reverse of the Nixon ploy with China versus Russia, and tried to paint this picture they were our allies to stimulate political thought. And it was our last chance. And the reason why I knew it was our last chance is that the B wave of the Kondratiev cycle was ending in 2020. That was the bit where Putin felt poor because oil prices were low. The moment the reversal took place, the man's ego from his revenues went through the roof and his aggression increased, and we lost it. Now, that alliance means that China cannot afford to see Russia turned to a liberal Western pro, state. So if they think Putin's about to lose in Ukraine, and they think a nationalist substitute will come that's even more right-wing, they don't really care, because we're not going to go over the Russian border, and the Chinese want to go when they're ready. And there's a whole paper I've just released in my Marinations, which explains why the Chinese are going to retake Taiwan, but they can't just retake Taiwan. To take, if you are a planner, you can't invade it because a surprise invasion gets just trashed in the Straits. You have to blockade it for at least 2 months, and you have to stop American submarines from interdicting. And then the Japanese come to your aid, and then the Americans come to the Japanese aid, and the Chinese Navy faces 2-to-1 odds, which is going to be a struggle. So, like the Japanese before, a preemptive surprise attack that is decisive is the only way to level the playing field and eject Japan and America from the second island chain. And then you can sit there and you can blockade Taiwan until it starves. And that is exactly what they've built with hypersonic glide weapons. And I've been warning literally since 2018 that hypersonic glide weapons, which are difficult, impossible to intercept, not like the Peninsula missile in Russia, much more difficult because they jink and they weave, essentially are the basis of destroying American carrier power. And just as you destroyed British battleships, which supported the empire, American carrier power, once that was destroyed, led the way to Ukraine. And this is the thing people don't realize, that one weapon system that destroyed the pedestal of American power effectively allowed Putin the window to think he could go ahead. Coupled with our weak state of political intention. And the signals are all. So I think right now we're waiting for the hammer to drop, and it is literally, it's any time going forward until the window closes where America develops counters to hypersonic glide weapons sufficient to survive saturation attacks. That's not going to be for 18 months. But the interception of these Kinzhal missiles in Ukraine must make Xi think, because technology has been narrowed, and it might narrow faster than he thinks and loses his window. So much as we applaud the interception, it actually is catalytic towards Chinese aggression.
Yes, and at the same time, though, we've got this incredible weakness in, certainly in American political power. They are so distracted. The Chinese might have a 50 or 100-year plan. Certainly America feels right now we don't even have a 6-month plan.
Well, I'm going to actually try and soothe the balm a little bit. And I've listened to pundits and people who've, used my model and I would say changed it in ways though it doesn't work, make predictions that America would end up in civil war. It will never end up in civil war, because before the civil war starts, the Chinese will engage America, which will unite the two parties. And there's a very good example in Britain. In the period between 1910 and 12, there were successive governments, there were political crisis between this liberal aspect, which is Biden's wealth distribution policy, is exactly the same, and the more conservative Republicans who didn't want to distribute wealth, and they were ripping each other's guts out. And when you read Churchill's book about the First War, his opening paragraph is, we all thought there would be a military takeover because the political body broke down until 2012, when they agreed, because of the threat of Germany, to unite. So the threat of China is going to bond both your parties, but probably too late, because that threat won't creep up on you. We're going to wake up one day and find everything within the second island chain has been destroyed, and we're at war with Pearl Harbor on steroids. And then, and this is an interesting thing, Biden was predictable after Trump because wealth distribution was just required from the electorate, because everyone in the West is getting poorer before inflation hit. And that poverty line moves up, and that means wealth distribution just suddenly becomes popular. So Biden was obvious. But the one thing about Biden was his dementia. And right now we have an incontinent, incompetent president, which begat this war from other dimensions with Afghanistan. And so I've often thought about what is really going on. And the big question is, who holds the reins of power in the White House right now? Because he is a puppet. And so who is it? Well, whatever it is, you've got the military body, which have done as much as they can within the realms of another perspective, which is don't aggravate the Russians into nuclear conflict. I mean, it's a very cautious Pavlov's dog response. So there's obviously a battle going on within the system. The idea that he's about to go through another electoral process suggests to me that the puppet masters want to keep being puppets, because, you know, the guy's mind will have disappeared long before the election. And I think that when conflict happens, and I say it is now inevitable that China will do this, just like it was inevitable that Putin would invade, it will be so disastrous that in the same way Chamberlain was wiped aside, your governing system will change, and your political bodies are not fit for purpose. And I think this sounds very extreme, but your military body contains some of your most capable people who wish to defend the nation. And there might be a very, very different moment where, you know, the pummeling has been so bad that in fact your political body is pushed aside for the survival of the nation, because it's completely incapable of responding.
It's absolutely failing at a grassroots level. It's literally everybody you speak to, and I speak to some very, very successful, incredibly wealthy people on you know, at 9 o'clock, and I will literally have a conversation with a guy, you know, and his dog down the road, and you know, we won't call any names at the moment. I've always had an ability to talk to anybody on any level in any way, and I find almost everybody that you speak to is absolutely united against the common enemy, which seems to be the political enrichment class at the moment. I mean, everyone I speak to is sick and tired of the politicians who are enriching themselves, who have their own set of rules for themselves. They're using the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, the SEC, any enforcement agency to basically run their own agenda against the people. And the common enemy is not China or Russia. Most people don't see it that way. They see politicians as the common enemy.
And what's interesting is that when a system moves out of regionalization and from its civil war, which is destructive but also lateralizing, all of those people that build actually serve the system. They serve it with a sense of national pride. In decline, it isn't about service to the bigger system. It's actually about the opposite, service to self. So all of these sort of woke constructs are where individuals that actually haven't done anything brilliant expect to be different and identified, not for what they do, but just by right. And that's the opposite of it. And within our political class, leaders don't serve the people they lead. And I think, you know, for all of those who watch the coronation, and, you know, there's pageantry, but there's a whole piece on my site about all of the hidden entwined history and the balance between God and king, and then the advent of parliament and the dynamics between the threads of power. But what Charles really emphasized was, as king, he was serving his people. He said it 3 times. If you can make every CEO and every politician commit to that bond, the world will be a different place. And there's, on my website, I've got some aspirations, and one of them describes what I call iconic leadership, how you identify what leadership is by the sense of service to the people. And what we have is, you know, politicians that have become billionaires while being full-time politicians, which is all you need to really think about. Where do they get their money from, and what is their agenda? Trouble is, how do you get them off the pot is got to be all of our questions. And the problem is, if you take Chamberlain and Halifax, literally they rode the horse into the brick wall. And only then did people turn around and say, we need change. And luckily there was an alternative to change too. The trouble is, in America and Britain, I can't see obvious candidates in the wings waiting to go. And one of the reasons, again, I sort of set up Global Forecaster, I'd never want to be a politician. It's not in my interest, but I would do it with the knowledge I have if it meant saving our state. And so it's the idea of creating authority by knowledge rather than what you look like, you know, who you've humbled, and maybe not. That's one of the destinies of this path. But it certainly can enable other people who are in a better position to do it. And we are into desperate times, and I'm dedicated to my children and our children's future, because we've had a good life. We've been privileged. We've lived one of the most hedonistic, lovely, gorgeous lives a human could ever live. But our children are now exposed to the same risk on the Ukrainian front lines everywhere. And we have to like put down our money grabbing hands and start thinking bigger and creating coherent action to make a difference. And that means
So
money support.
I have a quick proposal on this one. Why don't we consider this as part one? Have a quick little break, grab a coffee or grab a drink or a glass of wine. And then in part two, really think a little bit about, from the investment perspective, whether there are any kind of safe havens and what as investors we should be doing. How do we get out of this mess? You see what I mean? And then get a little bit deeper into the things that we can actually do in part two. What do you think about that?
That's a great idea. I love it.
Okay. All right. So I'll meet you back here in like a couple of minutes and we'll go to part two. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm a slightly constrained, so as you know, but then we'll cover all of that. And it's a great,
okay.
Great.
Perfect. Awesome. See you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.